Hello everyone. If you've been told that the story of Job is about unwavering patience, about a servant who passively accepts every bit of pain God sends his way, then you've been lied to. What we've been taught about Job is a sanitized version, a narrative that omits the true essence of his story. Behind the facade of blind faith and resignation lies the tale of a man who dared to rebel, who refused to accept dogma without reason, and who stood up and demanded an explanation from God himself. This is the story of Job, the rebel your pastor doesn't want you to know. The story of Job, as it's typically told, is simple. He was an upright, wealthy and blessed man. In a cosmic wager, the adversary tells God that Job only serves him because of his blessings. God gives the adversary permission to take everything away from Job, except his life. Job loses his possessions, his children, and his health. His wife tells him to curse God and die. 3 friends come to comfort him, but they end up preaching at him. They tell him he must have sinned, that his suffering is a punishment, that God is just and he must be guilty. But Job holds fast to his innocence, and in the end, God speaks to him from the whirlwind. Job repents, and God gives him back double what he lost. A story of patience, right? A happy ending. But this is a dangerous oversimplification. It's a narrative designed to justify suffering and to demand faith without questions. The book of Job, in its original form, is far more complex and revolutionary. It starts as a folktale, but at its heart, in the body of the text, is an epic poem of 35 chapters of pure questioning, anguish, and rebellion. The traditional narrative wants you to believe that Job is a simple example of a man who endured his pain without complaint, but that's not the case. The book of Job is not an apology for patience. It's a direct challenge to the idea that suffering is always a punishment for sin. Job, over the course of 35 chapters of poetry, laments, curses the day he was born, and pointedly argues with his friends and with God himself. Job is no silent servant. He's a litigant. He repeatedly tells his friends they are wrong. They, in their dogmatic mindset, insist that if he is suffering, he must have sinned. It's the theology of retribution, the idea that God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. It's a simple theology, but Job completely dismantles it. He tells them that the wicked often prosper and the righteous suffer. He says this with a fury and frustration that is rarely preached. The true essence of the book of Job is found in his complaints. Job doesn't accept his pain. He screams at the heavens. He questions God's morality. He tells God he is a tyrant, an adversary, a hunter. He says God treats him like a wild animal and pursues him without mercy. Job isn't looking for comfort. He's looking for justice. He doesn't stay quiet but raises his voice to challenge conventional wisdom and to demand that God himself show up and give him a reason. And the most fascinating part is that God answers that demand. But let's go back to the belief this story challenges. The idea that faith is the passive acceptance of suffering. This is the narrative most convenient for institutions. If they tell you that suffering is a mystery of God and your only option is to accept it with blind faith, they disempower you. They turn you into an obedient servant rather than a thinking being. The story of Job, however, shows us that the path to authentic faith is not resignation, but questioning. Job doesn't find God until he dares to scream his darkest questions at him. Imagine Job's audacity. Far from being a passive martyr, Job is a prophet in the line of Jeremiah or Elijah. He stands up and tells God that his system seems to be unjust. He tells him that if the theology of retribution is true, then God is not morally fair. This is a bold accusation, almost unthinkable in traditional religious circles. It's a man who refuses to be a mere pawn in a cosmic game. He demands an explanation and an answer, and the end of the book is even more revealing. When God finally answers from the whirlwind, he doesn't give Job the answers he was looking for. He doesn't tell him why he suffered. He doesn't justify the wager with the adversary. Instead, he takes Job on an epic tour of the universe, describing the immensity of creation, the complexity of the constellations, the wonder of wild animals. It's not an intellectual answer, but an experiential one. God doesn't answer the question of why, but invites Job to contemplate the wonder of the unknowable. He says, in essence, that reality is far more complex than a human mind can comprehend. And this is where Job surrenders, not out of resignation, but out of awe. His faith, in the end, is not that of a servant who obeys, but of a being who has found an unfathomable mystery, one that goes beyond his understanding, and yet he still chooses to trust it. Job doesn't repent for questioning God. In fact, at the end of the book, God scolds Job's friends for speaking incorrectly about him, and praises Job for having spoken honestly about him. God says to the friends, "My wrath is kindled against you and your 2 friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has done." Think about that. The faith of the friends, the faith that is dogmatic and justifies the suffering of others, is rejected by God. But the faith of Job, the faith that questions, screams, and demands answers, is accepted and praised. The story of Job is a fundamental lesson for modern faith. It teaches us that the road to God is not a paved highway of certainties and easy answers. The path is often a wilderness full of pain, questions, and darkness. And what keeps us on that path is not blind faith, but the courage to keep asking, to keep searching, even when God seems silent. The book of Job doesn't tell you how to live a life without suffering. It tells you how to live a life with suffering, how to face pain without giving up, and how to maintain an honest relationship with the divine, even when that relationship is filled with tension. True faith, Job teaches us, is not the absence of doubt, but the courage to maintain a dialogue with God despite it. The book of Job is an invitation to spiritual maturity. It's a call to leave behind the simplistic do-good and you will be well thinking and to embrace the complexity of a universe where goodness and pain often coexist in inexplicable ways. Job doesn't end with an answer, but with the revelation that the answer is not the most important thing. The relationship, the honest cry, the tireless search, that's what really matters. And it is in that honest and brave dialogue that true faith is found. I ask you now, if Job, the righteous man, had to go through a wilderness of pain to find a deeper faith, what is stopping you from asking the questions you need to ask? What dogma is preventing you from having an honest dialogue with God? The story of Job is no fairy tale. It's a guide for the modern spiritual seeker. A map that shows us that true faith is found in the cry,